A simple woman once raised her son alone, built a hidden empire in silence. But when she walked into her ex-fiance's wedding, one sentence from a waitress changed everything forever. "Where are you watching from?" The late afternoon light fell through the tall windows of the London flat, painting long golden bands across the oak floor, the kind of light that made you feel like the world had paused for a breath. In the kitchen, Sky Williams sat motionless, a half-finished cup of jasmine tea cooling between her fingers. Her gaze locked onto a single cream-colored envelope lying on the table as if it had the power to set her soul ablaze. It had arrived 2 days ago. No stamps, no return address, just her name written in a delicate calligraphy that was too beautiful to be anything but cruel. Not Miss Williams, not to the attention of just Skylar. Renee Williams. The name only a handful of people in the world still dared to use, a name stitched to a past she thought she had long since buried. She hadn't opened it at first. She'd stared at it, circled, it picked it up and set it down again, like it was an unexploded bomb left on her kitchen table. Eli, her 11-year-old son, had caught her in the act 2 nights ago as he swung his backpack down after school. "Mama," he said with a crooked smile and an arched eyebrow, "why are you looking at the mail like it just slapped you?" She had laughed then, a dry, broken sound that barely reached her lips, and said nothing. How could she explain to him that some ghost traveled by post? Well, hours later, with the silence pressing against her skin like a second heartbeat, she peeled the envelope open with hands that had once scrubbed floors balanced. A sleeping child on her hip carried groceries through the rain, and now, those same hands signed contracts, managed portfolios, and built unseen empires from the shadows. Inside was a thick ivory cardstock, gold-leaf text. The names glared at her with a kind of vicious sweetness. Malene Annabelle Huntington and Tyler James Brooks cordially invite you to their wedding celebration at Huntington Estate, Georgia, USA, Saturday, May 14th, 5 p.m. Sky stared at the invitation long after the words had seared themselves into her mind. Tyler Malene, Tyler, who had whispered promises against her neck at midnight and vanished into thin air when life got heavier than his dreams could bear. Tyler, who had left her 6 months pregnant and wondering how much love was really worth when it was weighed against shame. And Malene with her honeyed voice and manicured cruelty, who once giggled behind silk gloves about Sky's thrifted shoes and her lack of proper lineage. Malene the girl, with a smile like a scalpel. Of course it would be them. Of course it would be here. Of course they would invite her, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge dressed up in satin and gold leaf. Sky let the card fall to the table with a whisper of expensive paper against wood. She didn't need to read it again. The message wasn't hidden. It screamed, "Look what you could have had. Look what you lost. Look what you were never good enough to keep." And yet as she sat there, a strange calm unfurled inside her chest, because the girl they remembered no longer existed. The woman sitting here had built a fortress out of rejection and rainstorms. She had learned that the most dangerous thing about a storm wasn't the noise, it was the silence before it broke. And Sky had become an expert in holding her silence until it could split mountains. That night after dinner, Sky found Eli curled up on the sofa, absorbed in a documentary about African architecture. The boy was made of questions and stardust of dreams he wasn't afraid to say out loud. When the credits rolled, Sky placed the invitation in his lap. He read it without speaking, his forehead creasing deeper with every line. "Is this real?" he asked finally. "He's getting married," she confirmed, voice steady, almost clinical. Eli stared at the card, then up at her with a look she couldn't quite name. "Then why did they invite you?" Sky shrugged one shoulder. "Maybe they want me to see it. Maybe they think I won't show." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that cleaved the room in half. "You should go." Sky blinked. "Why on earth would I do that?" He still didn't look up, just traced the edge of the card with his thumb. "Because you're not who they remember, and they need to see that." The words landed like a hammer on old stone. She wanted to laugh, to tell him that it didn't matter, that she had no need to parade herself before people who had already made up their minds about her. But in her heart, something shifted. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about pride. It was about memory, about reclaiming the narrative. Not for them, for herself, and for the boy who deserved to know that survival wasn't shameful. It was sacred. The next morning, Sky made a call to the only person outside of Eli who still felt like family. Uncle Joe, her mother's brother, a retired mechanic who had taught her how to change a tire before she could legally drive, and who never once asked her why Tyler disappeared. "You tell me where and when," he said without hesitation. "I'll be there." Sky booked the flight herself, though she hadn't flown commercial in years. WSW Holdings handled travel arrangements for their executives under discreet aliases, and Sky was the ghost in their machine. The invisible hand behind real estate deals, venture capital fundings, tech startups. On paper, she didn't exist. In reality, she owned more than half the skyline in 3 cities. But none of that mattered. Not for this. This wasn't about power. This wasn't about wealth. This was about a boy asleep in the next room who had never once seen his mother beg. And he wasn't going to start now. 3 days later, as the private jet angled toward the lush fields of Georgia, Sky sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window. The land looked the same: endless green fields, silver ribbons of river, the occasional glint of an estate's rooftop catching the sun like a blade. It looked the same, but she was not. This time she wasn't coming back as the outsider hoping to belong. She was coming back as the storm. When the wheels touched down, a black SUV was already waiting. Eli climbed into the back seat beside her, his nose pressed to the window, wide-eyed at the sheer expanse of it all. "Is this where you lived?" he asked softly once. Sky replied, "But not anymore." She smiled, small and certain. "No, baby, not anymore." "Maybe not." As the car wound its way past wrought iron gates and sweeping drives lined with magnolia trees, Sky felt a strange sensation blooming in her chest. Not fear, recognition. This was the soil where they had buried her, but they had buried her alive, and now she had grown into something they no longer had the tools to cut down. They thought they were inviting a ghost. What they had summoned instead was the reckoning. And she would walk through their golden gates not to reclaim a seat at their table, but to remind them what you discard sometimes blooms, and it blooms stronger than you ever dared imagine. The air in Georgia was thicker than Sky remembered, humid and sweet, with the scent of magnolia, as the black SUV crept along the gravel path toward the Huntington estate. From the back seat, Eli pressed his forehead lightly against the window, his breath fogging a soft circle onto the glass. Sky watched him for a moment, a quiet current of emotions pulling under her calm surface. He was so still, so composed. But she knew his mind was weaving 1,000 questions he hadn't yet found the words to ask. Ahead, the estate rose from the rolling hills like a relic of another time. Tall white columns, sprawling verandas, hedges trimmed with a precision that only old money could afford. Sky felt a dull ache in her ribs, not fear, not grief, but something older. A residue from another life she had lived and left behind. The car slowed near the service entrance, not the grand front gates where the other guests would be arriving, but a side path lined with battered oaks and the faint smell of wet earth. Sky had specifically asked for this discretion. The last thing she needed was to make a spectacle of herself before she was ready. The driver, a man with kind eyes and a silent understanding, opened the door for them. Eli hopped out first, his small suitcase bumping along behind him. Sky stepped onto the gravel and tilted her face up toward the soft gray sky. Clouds were gathering, thick and low, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Inside the guest wing, a young woman in a crisp navy uniform led them to their suite. It was beautiful, of course, polished wood floors, a fireplace framed with white marble French doors that opened onto a small private garden. Yet despite the luxury, there was an unmistakable chill in the air, an invisible line drawn to separate them from the world unfolding in the main house. Sky ran her hand along the edge of the writing desk, noting the absence of personal touches. No flowers, no welcome note, just an efficiency that said, "You are here, but you are not part of this." As the attendant left, Sky turned to Eli, who was methodically unpacking his few belongings. "You okay?" she asked. He shrugged, lifting one shoulder, but didn't meet her eyes. "Feels weird." Sky crossed the room and knelt in front of him, her hands resting lightly on his arms. "It's supposed to—" "Oh," she said softly, "that doesn't mean we don't belong here." He nodded the movement, small but sure, and she pressed a kiss to his forehead before standing. There was a knock at the door. Then sharp and efficient, Sky opened it to find an older woman in a sharply tailored gray suit. House management, no doubt. The woman handed her a folded card with a tight smell. "Miss Williams," she said, voice clipped, "a schedule of the weekend's events." Sky accepted it with a nod, closed the door and unfolded the card. Welcome brunch, garden tour, rehearsal dinner, ceremony reception. The hours stretched before her like stepping stones across a river she had no desire to cross. She spent the next few hours in the garden with Eli, walking between rose bushes and topiaries shaped like swans, listening to him recount facts from the documentary he had been watching the night before. It grounded her, steadied her later. As dusk crept over the estate and fairy lights blinked to life along the hedges, Sky retreated to the suite to dress. She chose a deep sapphire dress, simple but devastatingly cut, paired with understated jewelry and a single pair of ivory heels. Her hair she swept back into a loose chignon strands, escaping just enough to soften the steel in her posture. When she emerged, Eli whistled under his breath. "You look serious," he said, grinning. She smoothed his jacket lapels, fixing his tie with a deft flick of her fingers. "I am serious," she said, her voice low. "Tonight we don't just walk into a room. We walk into history." He nodded solemnly, and together they stepped out into the evening. The main house buzzed with life, laughter, and clinking glasses spilling through open doors. Valets in crisp white gloves ushered guests toward the main hall, where chandeliers sparkled overhead like fallen stars. As Sky and Eli approached, conversations faltered. Eyes turned. There was a moment, a breathless, flickering second, where the room seemed to tilt on its axis. Sky felt it. But she kept walking. The maitre d' intercepted them with the politeness of someone expertly trained to neutralize disruptions. He led them to a table near the edge of the room, perfectly positioned to be present, yet peripheral. As they sat, Sky took in the crowd. Men in bespoke suits with silver cufflinks, women in floor-length gowns dripping with understated wealth. Laughter rang out from tight circles, but it didn't reach the eyes. It was all performance, all glass and gilding. Then she saw them, Michelle and Malene, standing at the head of the room, basking in the adoration of their curated world. Tyler looked older, lines etched deeper at the corners of his mouth, his once boyish charm hardened into something brittle. And Malene was every inch the queen she had always aspired to be. Her dress was a masterpiece of delicate lace and silk, her hair a golden crown. But Sky noticed the cracks first. The stiffness at the edges of Tyler's smile, the tension in Malene's perfectly poised shoulders. They weren't invincible. They never had been. It was only Sky back then who had believed otherwise. "Mom," Eli whispered, tugging gently at her sleeve. "They're looking at us." Sky smiled, a slow, private smile meant only for him. "Good," she murmured. "Let them." An attendant appeared with champagne flutes, offering one to Sky. She declined with a polite shake of her head and instead asked for sparkling water. The boy serving them, barely older than Eli, gave her a respectful nod, as if he understood more than he was supposed to. Dinner passed in a haze of polite conversation and brittle laughter. Sky barely touched her food. She didn't need to eat. She was feeding on something else tonight, something sharper. As the plates were cleared and the first toasts began, Sky felt the room's attention shift toward the grand staircase. Malene descended with Tyler at her side, her laughter ringing out just a shade too loud. She took the microphone from the MC with a practiced ease, flashing a dazzling smile at the crowd. "I just want to say," she began, "how grateful we are for all of you, for second chances, for forgiveness, for new beginnings." Sky watched her unmoving as Malene's eyes skimmed the crowd, then locked onto her. A beat, a flicker. Then Malene's smile sharpened like a blade hidden behind velvet. "And of course," she continued sweetly, "we're especially touched to be surrounded by so many dear friends, old and new." There was a ripple of polite laughter, the kind that smoothed over barbs without ever acknowledging their sting. Sky tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the jab with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Eli stiffened beside her, his hand curling into a fist in his lap. She reached over, gently covered his hand with hers. Not yet. The game had only just begun. After the speeches, the crowd began to mingle again, champagne flowing like a river. Nobody dared step into too deeply. Sky rose from her chair, smoothing her dress with an absent hand. "Walk with me," she said to Eli. They wove through the crowd, polite nods and curious glances, following them like a shadow as they passed the long hall that led toward the library. One of the few places in the estate Sky remembered fondly. She heard her name, Sky. She turned slowly. Tyler stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a half-empty glass of bourbon. For a moment, he just looked at her as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the memory he had abandoned. "You came," he said finally, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "I was invited," Sky said simply. He opened his mouth to say something else, but Sky raised one hand, cutting him off. "Not here," she said quietly, her voice steady as the earth. "Not tonight." And she turned, taking Eli's hand. leaving Tyler standing there with his drink and his regret. Because tonight wasn't about old wounds. Tonight was about the quiet power of surviving, of showing up, of standing tall in the ruins they had once tried to bury her in. And as the music swelled behind her, Sky felt it rising inside her too, that slow, unstoppable momentum, the beginning of the storm. The night deepened as the reception moved into full swing laughter, spilling across the lawn, fairy lights casting halos around the guests like 1,000 tiny false stars. The air was thick with champagne and old money, the kind of atmosphere that cloaked old sins in polished gold and called it celebrations. She stood near the periphery of the crowd, one hand resting lightly on the stem of a glass she hadn't touched. Eli was a quiet shadow beside her eyes, keen and watchful. He said little, but his hand brushed hers from time to time, a silent tether that grounded them both. The speeches resumed, each one more self-congratulatory than the last, and Sky allowed herself to drift, to let her mind circle the edges of this gathering like a hawk too high to be seen. Tyler's father stood and made a toast about new beginnings, his voice heavy with the weight of things he would never say aloud. Malene's mother praised resilience and forgiveness, phrases so carefully chosen they became meaningless. Sky remained a statue among shifting tides, the sapphire of her dress catching the light, a beacon no one could ignore, even if they pretended to. A small disturbance at the service entrance caught her attention, a minor thing easily missed. A young woman, dark hair pinned in a tight knot, moved through the crowd carrying a tray of empty glasses. Something about her posture was different. Not deferential, not blurred into the background like the rest of the staff. There was a purpose to her stride, a weight to the way her eyes scanned the room, lingering fractionally longer on Sky before moving on. Sky noted it, tucked it away, said nothing. Eli shifted beside her. "Mom," he murmured, "that girl, she's—" "I see her," Sky said under her breath. "Stay close." The band struck up a lively tune and couples began to spill onto the dance floor, laughing and spinning under the stars. Tyler and Malene took the first turn, their movements smooth, polished, rehearsed. Sky watched without expression as Tyler whispered something into Malene's ear that made her laugh, a fraction too loudly. The young woman with the tray circled closer. Her path wasn't random. It was deliberate, threading through the crowd with the precision of someone stalking prey. She brushed past Sky once, just close enough that the faintest whisper of a note fluttered to the ground at Sky's feet. No one else noticed. Without looking down, Sky moved her foot to cover it. She waited a beat, then two, before bending gracefully as if adjusting the strap of her heel, scooping the scrap of paper into her palm in one fluid motion. "Meet me behind the East 10 at midnight. I know the truth." Sky folded the note into her fist and straightened her face, giving away nothing. Midnight, a risky move. Bold, but whoever the girl was, she had chosen her side. Time dragged. The evening blurred into a symphony of clinking glasses, brittle laughter, shallow compliments. Every minute Sky felt the tension winding tighter, a storm coiling beneath her ribs. She watched Malene move from guest to guest, radiant and ruthless, cataloging each handshake, each whispered exchange like a queen surveying her court. Tyler followed a half step behind, smiling, drinking, fraying at the edges. At 1:45, Sky touched Eli's arm. "Time to move," she said. He didn't ask questions. He trusted her in a way that humbled and terrified her all at once. They slipped through the outer fringes of the reception, past caterers, breaking down empty stations and florists, rearranging sagging centerpieces. The east tent loomed ahead, quieter, partially obscured by thick hedges and towering oaks. Sky kept Eli close as they rounded the last hedge. The girl was already there waiting. Up close, she looked even younger than Sky had guessed, no more than 19, 20 at most. Her uniform was rumpled. Her shoes scuffed, her hands trembling slightly as she wrung them together. But her eyes were steady and fierce. "You came," she breathed. Sky inclined her head. "You left me little choice." The girl licked her lips nervously. "I didn't know how else to reach you. They told us not to speak to the guests, especially not to you." Sky's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. "I'm not surprised." The girl took a deep breath as if steeling herself. "My name's Annalise," she said. "I work here part-time. My mother," she swallowed hard. "She used to clean for the Huntingtons before she got fired." "Why?" Sky asked, though she already knew. Annalise's hands twisted tighter. "She got sick. Couldn't keep up with the shifts. They let her go without severance, said it would reflect poorly if people found out." Sky's stomach turned, but her face remained placid. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but what does that have to do with me?" Annalise glanced around as if afraid the trees themselves might overhear. I know what they did to you, she whispered. I know why they invited you here. Sky's breath caught, but she forced herself to stay still. Go on. Annalise fumbled in her apron pocket and withdrew a folded sheaf of papers worn soft at the edges. I found these in the old files, she said, voice shaking. Before they could shred them, Sky reached out and took the bundle. She unfolded the pages under the dim light. Legal correspondence, affidavits, payments. The words leapt off the page like fire. It wasn't just abandonment. It wasn't just betrayal. It was orchestrated. Tyler's family had paid off doctors, manipulated court filings, scrubbed Sky's name from financial records, all to sever any legal claim she and Eli might have had to the Huntington estate. They had buried her existence not just socially but legally. The weight of it hit her like a freight train. For years she had thought it was Tyler's cowardice, Malene's malice. But it was bigger than that. It had been systematic, strategic, a surgical removal. They said you wouldn't fight, Annalise whispered, that you didn't have the resources, that you'd disappear. Sky's hands trembled slightly as she folded the documents back into a neat square. She looked at Annalise, really looked at her. A girl standing on the edge of a precipice, risking everything for a stranger. Why bring this to me now? Sky asked softly. Annalise lifted her chin, eyes flashing. Because I'm tired of watching them win. Something inside Sky, something old and wounded, shuddered and straightened its spine. Thank you, she said simply. Annalise's shoulders sagged with relief. Sky tucked the papers into the lining of her clutch. Careful, deliberate. You've done more than enough, she said. Now go before someone sees you. Annalise hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Sky stood alone for a moment, the cool night air pressing against her skin. This changed everything. They hadn't just broken her heart. They had tried to erase her existence and they had failed. Slowly, Sky turned back toward the tent, back toward the stage where the toasts would resume soon. Back toward the lion's den. Only now she wasn't prey. She was fire and she was carrying truth like a sword. The night was far from over. Sky walked back toward the reception tent with measured steps, the bundle of damning documents secured inside her clutch. Her heart a slow, deliberate drumbeat against her ribs. The music floated through the air, sweet and syrupy, masking the poison swirling just beneath the surface. She could see the crowd gathered again near the head table, champagne glasses refilled. Laughter louder now, desperate in a way that only those clinging to illusion could muster. She spotted Eli first standing near a pillar at the edge of the tent, arms crossed over his chest, eyes scanning the room like a soldier at watch. When he saw her approach, his shoulders loosened a fraction, but he didn't smile. He knew. He felt the electricity vibrating in the air, just as she did. Sky reached him and touched his arm briefly, grounding them both. Stay close, she said softly. He nodded once sharp, and sure, the kind of silent agreement that passed between people who understood that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. The master of ceremonies tapped his microphone, drawing the guests' attention back toward the stage where Tyler and Malene now stood bathed in the glow of the chandeliers. Malene clutched her champagne flute like a scepter, her smile wide, perfect hollow. We have a few words to say before the night is through. She trilled, her voice carrying easily over the crowd. Tonight is a celebration of love, of family, of new beginnings. Sky felt the weight of Annalise's papers against her palm and knew with bone-deep certainty that Malene wasn't just performing gratitude, she was staging a final erasure, a rewriting of history in real time, counting on everyone present to accept the version laid out before them. Not tonight. Sky waited as Malene prattled on about destiny, about second chances. Tyler stood stiffly beside her, nodding at the right moments, but his eyes drifted more and more often toward the crowd, toward Sky, unable to resist the gravity building around her. Sky let them finish. She let the applause swell and die. Then she stepped forward. At first, no one noticed. She moved with the kind of grace that didn't draw attention until it demanded it, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, the slit of her sapphire dress whispering around her ankles. The crowd parted unconsciously, making way for something they didn't yet understand but instinctively feared. Eli stayed at her side, a silent sentry. Sky reached the center of the floor and turned slowly to face the crowd. Silence fell like a curtain. She lifted the microphone from the stand, With a calm hand, her touch so steady it seemed almost rehearsed. For a moment, she simply looked at them, their expectant faces, their polite confusion, their dawning apprehension. She smiled then, not cruelly, not triumphantly, just the way a woman smiles when she has finally fully remembered who she is. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, she began, her voice carrying easily in the heavy stillness. But seeing so many familiar faces and hearing so many beautiful words about love and truth, I felt moved to share a little truth of my own. There was a stir among the guests, a tightening of shoulders, a sharpening of gazes. Somewhere near the head table, Maline's hand tightened visibly around her glass. Sky continued, her voice, even almost gentle. Some of you know me, some of you think you do. 11 years ago, I was engaged to Tyler James Brooks. Gasps scattered through the crowd like pebbles dropped into water. Some of you also know that I was 6 months pregnant when he left, she said, pausing just long enough for the words to sink in. What you may not know is what happened after. She opened her clutch and drew out the folded documents with the same calm reverence one might reserve for sacred texts. In the months that followed, while I struggled to survive, while I brought our son into the world alone, Tyler's family was busy too. Busy paying off lawyers, busy scrubbing records, busy erasing any trace of me and my child from their perfect little empire. Murmurs rippled outward, a wave of disbelief and fascination. And for some shame, Sky held up a page, turning slowly so that all could see the Huntington letterhead stamped in gold. These are the contracts, the payments, the affidavits, proof that they didn't just turn their backs. They buried us. Her voice remained steady, almost heartbreakingly so. And tonight you invited me here not to honor the past, she said, eyes locking with Maline's across the room. You invited me here to bury it all over again, to parade your victory, to crown yourselves saints in a church built from the bones of the people you destroyed. A brittle laugh broke from Maline's lips, high and strained. This is ridiculous, she said sharply. You're just speaking. Sky cut in smoothly. And you will listen. The authority in her tone was undeniable. I didn't come here for revenge. Sky continued, softer now, almost tender. I came because my son deserves to know that truth is never something to be ashamed of. I came because I refuse to be the ghost you pretend never existed. Eli stepped forward, then drawing all eyes to him, standing tall and unflinching. This is my mother, he said, his voice clear and unwavering. And no matter how much you tried to erase her, she built something stronger than any of you ever could. The guests stood frozen, caught between loyalty and a truth so raw it peeled the paint from their perfect walls. Sky turned back to the crowd, her final words low but resonant. Love without accountability is not love, she said. It's cowardice, and I will not wear your shame for you anymore. She set the microphone down gently, the sound of it touching the stand echoing through the stunned silence. Then, without waiting for permission, without waiting for applause, Sky took Eli's hand and began to walk away. Behind them, the spell broke. Voices rose in confused murmurs, chairs scraped harshly against the floor. Cameras flashed, desperate to capture the moment. History cracked open. Maline surged forward, furious, her veneer shattered. You don't get to do this, she hissed loud enough for those nearest to hear. You don't get to ruin everything. Sky stopped, turned slowly. If everything can be ruined by the truth, she said, voice like a blade wrapped in silk, then it was never real to begin with. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, Sky calm and unbreakable, Maline trembling with impotent rage. Then Sky smiled once, small and serene, and turned her back for the last time. As she and Eli reached the edge of the tent, Annalise appeared from the shadows, her face pale but shining with a kind of fierce pride. She gave Sky a nod, a silent salute. Sky returned it with a glance full of gratitude, of recognition. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin, the first stars blinking awake in the darkening sky. Eli squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. Behind them, the Huntington Empire reeled, their carefully curated story, crumbling under the weight of a truth they could no longer suppress. Sky didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was ashes. The future was hers to build. And this time she would build it in the light, the morning after the storm. The Huntington estate sat in stunned silence, a once mighty fortress, bruised and flickering under the weak Georgia sun. Sky stood by the window of the guest house, a cup of black coffee cooling between her palms. watching the groundskeepers quietly dismantling the remnants of the wedding. White folding chairs stacked into crooked towers, half-wilted roses swept into piles like forgotten promises. Crystal glasses left abandoned on linen-draped tables. There was no music now, no laughter, no careful orchestration to mask the cracks. Only the simple, unadorned sound of something ending. Behind her, Eli was still sleeping, curled under the heavy quilt, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. He hadn't said much when they returned from the reception the night before. He didn't need to. His eyes had said enough. The pride and the relief, the solemn understanding that some battles don't end in victory parades but in quiet reclamations of dignity. Skye turned back to the window, sipping her coffee, feeling the enormity of what had happened settle into her bones. There had been no grand confrontation after they left the tent, no desperate attempts from Malene or Tyler to salvage the night. The truth had done what she needed it to do. It had spoken for itself, stripping away the illusion until only the raw, uncomfortable reality remained. And now there was only the aftermath. A soft knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. She set the coffee down, crossed the room, and opened the door to find Uncle Joe standing there, a suitcase in one hand, his cap pushed back on his head. "You ready, baby girl?" he asked, voice low and kind. Skye smiled, a slow, genuine thing that reached her eyes. "Yeah," she said, "I'm ready." They packed quickly, efficiently, the way people do when they know there's nothing left to hold them in a place. Skye moved through the room with a deliberate calm, folding clothes, closing drawers, wiping away any trace that they had ever been there. Eli stirred halfway through, blinking blearily at her from the bed. "We going home?" he mumbled. Skye tucked a stray curl behind his ear. "Yellow. We're going home." An hour later, they stood at the edge of the gravel drive, the SUV waiting with the engine humming low. Skye took one last look at the house rising behind them, the grand columns, the ivy-choked walls, the heavy windows that had once seemed so impenetrable. It didn't feel like an exile anymore. It felt like leaving a mausoleum. She turned her back on it without hesitation. The drive to the private airstrip was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Eli leaned against her side, half asleep, while Uncle Joe whistled tunelessly under his breath. From the front seat, Skye watched the fields blur past the old oaks, standing like sentinels along the road, and felt an unexpected lightness bloom in her chest. At the airstrip, the jet was already waiting. WWSW Holdings. No family crest, no name carved into the fuselage. Just sleek, anonymous power, the way Skye preferred it. They boarded without ceremony. As the plane lifted into the pale sky, Skye looked down at the shrinking estate, at the neatly carved lawns and sprawling hedges, and felt nothing but a cool, cleansing detachment. Some roots once cut never grow back. Back in London, the days slid into each other, clean and ordinary, and blessedly uneventful. Skye threw herself back into work, not because she needed to, but because building had always been her way of healing. Meetings, contracts, projects. She moved through them with a quiet ferocity. Each success, a brick laid firmly into a future no one else had a claim to. Eli returned to school, his steps lighter, his shoulders squared. There was a new confidence in him now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Skye saw it in the way he answered questions in class without hesitating, the way he volunteered for debates, the way he laughed more freely with friends. One evening, a week after their return, Eli found her at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread before her. Drafts, ideas, scraps of a future she hadn't dared to dream before now. "You're starting something new," he said, not a question. Skye smiled without looking up. "I am." He pulled out a chair and sat beside her, peering at the papers with interest. The second thread. He read aloud from one of the mock-up logos. "What's that?" Skye set her pen down and turned to face him full. "It's a foundation," she said. "A place for women who've been through things, a place to help them rebuild. Connect, grow." Eli considered this for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. "Like what you did," he said, "for yourself." Skye reached out and ruffled his hair gently. "Exactly." The days grew longer as spring deepened into summer. The foundation took shape faster than Skye could have anticipated. Donations rolled in. From unexpected places, old colleagues reached out, offering support. Volunteers signed up in droves. It turned out there were more people hungry for a second chance than she had ever imagined. They hosted their first workshop in a modest community center. The walls painted a cheerful yellow, the table set with simple white flowers. Sky stood at the front of the room that first day looking out at a sea of faces, young and old, scarred and smiling, and felt a deep, bone-deep certainty settle into her. This was why she had survived. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for this, to build a new story, to offer the thread of hope to someone else. That night, after the last guest had gone home and the chairs had been stacked against the wall, Sky and Eli walked along the Thames, the city lights shimmering on the water. "You proud of yourself yet?" Eli asked, bumping her shoulder with his. Sky laughed, a low, rich sound that startled even herself. "I'm proud of us," she said, "of what we're building." He smiled, a real smile, wide and unguarded. "You know," he said, "for a long time I thought maybe we were missing something. That not having him around meant we weren't complete." Sky looked at him sharply, but he shook his head. "I don't think that anymore," he said. "We weren't missing anything. We were becoming." She stopped walking, blinking hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. "You," she said thickly, "are the best thing I've ever built." Eli grinned, mischievous and warm. "Yeah, I know." And they stood there for a while, mother and son, watching the river flow past, the lights dancing on its restless surface, no longer defined by absence, no longer waiting for permission to move forward, just two people, whole and fierce, and finally gloriously free. In the months that followed, the second thread grew beyond anything Sky had dared to hope. Branches opened in other cities. Online forums buzzed with life and laughter and stories reclaimed from the ashes. Women who had been forgotten found each other, found themselves. Sky never sought the spotlight. She didn't need to. The work spoke for itself, and late at night when the world quieted and the ghosts slipped away, Sky would sit at her kitchen table, pen in hand, writing it all down. Not the polished, edited version. Not the story others wanted to tell, the real one. The one where survival wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The one where a simple woman, armed with nothing but grit and grace, took the threads they tried to unravel and wove them into a tapestry stronger and more beautiful than anything they had ever imagined. Sometimes Sky thought the most extraordinary stories didn't begin with triumph. They began with a woman refusing to be erased, and that she knew now was more than enough. It was everything. The stars blinked overhead, silent witnesses to her becoming. Sky smiled up at them, whispered a thank you to the darkness, and went back inside. Home at last.